The moment Sylvia pointed at Grant Mallory and told the assembled executives of Crowe Capital Partners that the maintenance man should be removed from her sight before she negotiated anything worth discussing, she was 3 hours away from losing the most important deal of her career. She did not know his name. She did not know that the quiet man in the gray uniform, standing 3 feet from her, was the sole inventor of a piece of software her company had been trying to license for the better part of 8 months. She knew only that he had interrupted her venue walkthrough to mention a ventilation fault in the East Wing corridor and that the interruption had embarrassed her in front of the people she was trying to impress. Grant Mallory did not argue. He noted the fault on his clipboard, stepped back through the service door, and let the Crowe Capital Group continue their walkthrough. He had been chief building engineer at the Alderton Grand for 11 years, long enough to know that the people who needed to make others feel small in hallways were almost always the same people who had never figured out how to feel large on their own. He thought about his daughter Zoe as he walked back through the corridor. The way she had asked him that morning at breakfast, her spoon moving slow circles through her oatmeal, whether he was finally going to quit the hotel once the licensing deal went through. He told her he hadn't decided yet. She looked at him the way she always did when she suspected the answer was already made, and he simply wasn't ready to say it out loud. Zoe Mallory was 15 and had lived her entire life watching her father operate 2 versions of himself inside the same quiet body. Days were for the hotel, the boiler rooms, the HVAC systems, the precise and unglamorous work of keeping a building breathing correctly for the people inside it. Nights were for frame check. She had grown up with the software the way other children grew up with a parent's workshop hobby. The laptop hum behind the closed office door, the structural model spread across the kitchen table on weekends, the calls her father took in a low and careful voice that she had learned not to interrupt. After her mother died 4 years earlier, those late nights grew longer. Grant never explained it in words Zoe could have quoted back to him, but she understood without being told that the work was the thing keeping him oriented when grief had stripped everything else of its usual logic. Frame check had grown from a problem that bothered Grant for years, the gap between routine building inspections and the slow, invisible stress that accumulated in a structure across the long months between them. He had built the first version on a second-hand laptop during overnight shifts, pulling from the structural engineering degree that had sat quietly unused for years, while he raised a daughter and managed a building that other people lived and worked inside of. The software detected micro-stress patterns in load-bearing systems before those patterns became failures, not dramatic visible cracks. The slow, invisible degradation that only showed up after someone was already hurt. By the time the first major engineering firm called, FrameCheck had already been licensed quietly to 3 regional inspection companies, and Grant had incorporated Mallory Structural Systems using a post office box address and his attorney's suite number so that his day job stayed cleanly separate from negotiations that were still too uncertain to talk about in public. He had kept his identity out of the Crowe Capital discussions deliberately, as he had done with every negotiation before it. His attorney Arthur Kane handled all direct contact. The reason was simple and practical. Grant had learned early that the moment people knew who he was and where he worked, they stopped evaluating the technology and started evaluating him. He had no interest in being evaluated that way until after the ink was on the page. The Crowe Capital dinner began at 7:30 in the ballroom. Grant was not scheduled to be there. He was tracking a sensor reading near the elevator shafts when the floor manager called. A slow pipe leak had developed behind the catering station. Could Grant handle it quietly before the executive dinner was disrupted? Grant handled it. He was still crouched behind the catering partition when Sylvia Crowe's voice carried through from the ballroom side. She was telling Brett Lawson, her chief operating officer, that the real estate sector had grown soft in its willingness to let software developers set terms on technology agreements, and that anyone who thought an independent inventor had more leverage than the company holding the capital was living in a fantasy. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone who had long ago stopped adjusting her volume for rooms. She didn't believe she had to earn. Grant finished the repair, dried his hands on the work cloth at his belt, and stepped back into the ballroom corridor to update the floor manager. He was crossing toward the service exit when Sylvia Crowe spotted him, the gray uniform, the toolbox, the clipboard, and called after him to stop. She wanted the temperature in the private dining room adjusted. She had already submitted the request twice, she said, and it had not been handled to her satisfaction. Her voice carried the edge of someone cataloging grievances, and she had not once looked directly at him. Grant told her he would have it corrected within 10 minutes. She said she hoped he understood that basic competence was the least a 5-star property could manage, and then added, just loudly enough for Brett Lawson and 2 other executives to hear, that she had never understood why hotels continued to hire people who treated reliability as though it were optional. Brett Lawson offered the soft, practiced laugh of a man who had calibrated his reactions to his employer's moods over a long professional relationship. Grant had the temperature corrected in 8 minutes. He returned once to confirm, said nothing additional, and went back to the elevator sensor that hadn't resolved itself. He was nearly finished when Tom Reardon called, the hotel's general manager and the closest thing Grant had to a friend on that property. The Crowe Capital table had created a grievance out of a reserved wine that the sommelier had correctly marked unavailable, and the situation had landed entirely on Brenna Walsh, a 23-year-old junior server who had been at the Alderton for 8 months and was currently standing in the corridor outside the ballroom close to tears. Tom's voice was careful and even, which was how Grant knew the situation had already moved past the point of easy correction. He went back down. Sylvia Crowe was standing near the ballroom entrance when Grant arrived, finishing a sentence to Brenna Walsh about the importance of knowing one's role in a professional environment. Brenna had done nothing except explain, correctly and politely, that the reserved Burgundy was unavailable. Grant stepped in before Tom could and told Sylvia the wine issue had been a miscommunication on the building operations side, not the servers, and that he would personally ensure the preferred alternative was brought to the table within 5 minutes. Sylvia looked at him for the first time with genuine attention. "You're the maintenance man," she said, the way someone might identify a piece of furniture they hadn't noticed before. "Chief building engineer," Grant said, "but yes." She studied him briefly in the way people study things they are deciding whether to dismiss entirely. Then she said that the distinction seemed largely academic to her, and that in any case, neither position qualified a person to make promises on behalf of the hotel's food service operation. He let that go. He arranged for the wine. Brenna Walsh returned to her section, color still high in her face, but no longer at the edge of anything irreparable. The evening might have stayed at that level, friction without consequence, if Brett Lawson hadn't made a comment during the second course, loud enough to carry. He was explaining to the developers across from him that FrameCheck would ultimately need to be rebuilt by Crowe Capital's own engineering team, since the original developer was clearly some kind of independent operator with no real understanding of how corporate-scale implementation worked. He said the word independent with just enough weight to mean something considerably smaller. Grant was standing at the service station, restocking water glasses. He heard the name of his own software and set the pitcher down. He said, without raising his voice, that the sensor calibration architecture in FrameCheck had been designed specifically for large-scale deployment and had been tested across 14 commercial properties with a 0 false negative rate over 3 years of continuous monitoring. He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without performance. The table went quiet. Sylvia Crowe turned from her conversation and looked at Grant with an expression that moved quickly from surprise to something considerably colder. "Did the maintenance man just comment on our acquisition strategy?" she said. "I made a technical correction," Grant said. She pushed back from her chair, not fully, just enough to use her height and her tailored suit and the complete attention of 11 executives as instruments of correction. "People like you maintain things," she said. "People like me build empires. And what happens at this table has nothing to do with you. Do you understand that? Or does someone need to call your supervisor?" Grant looked at her without any particular expression. "Is the licensing meeting still on for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning?" he asked. Sylvia laughed, the bright social laugh of someone performing certainty for a room. Brett Lawson echoed it. Two executives at the far end of the table smiled without fully understanding why. She was still laughing when Arthur Kane walked through the ballroom entrance alongside Monica Tran, Crowe Capital's general counsel, both of them arriving to confirm the final procedural details for the morning signing. Arthur saw Grant beside the service station, and his expression shifted immediately and completely. He crossed the room in 12 steps. Monica Tran had the contract folder open before she reached the table. She looked at the identification photograph clipped inside the front cover. She looked at the man in the gray uniform beside the water station. The color left her face in a way that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Arthur Kane addressed Sylvia Crowe by name and told her that the man she had just asked to mind his business was Grant Mallory, founder of Mallory Structural Systems and the sole inventor of FrameCheck, whose signature she required on the exclusive licensing agreement scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. The laughter stopped. Sylvia stood very still, the way people stand when the ground has shifted, and they are deciding whether to acknowledge it or pretend it hasn't. Then she said this was obviously some kind of misunderstanding, possibly a test of some kind, and that she hoped everyone could appreciate the situation for the humor it contained. Grant untucked the work cloth from his belt and set it on the service cart. He told her it was not a test. He had worked at the Alderton Grand for 11 years before FrameCheck was worth anything to anyone, and he had continued working there because the work was honest and the people he worked alongside were worth staying for. He said that what troubled him was not the comments about his uniform or his role. It was the ease of them, the absolute certainty that she could speak to anyone in any service position in any way she chose without calculation, because she had never once been required to consider the cost of it. Sylvia recalibrated instantly. She offered to add $4 million to the licensing agreement. She suggested a private accommodation for any misunderstanding that may have occurred. She proposed a joint press statement framing the evening as a creative team-building exercise in perspective. Her voice moved from social laughter to professional warmth without passing through anything that resembled an actual feeling. Grant asked Arthur Kane to send the formal withdrawal notice to Crowe Capital's legal team. Then, he picked up the service pitcher and finished filling the water glasses at the table. By the following morning, Crowe Capital's communications office had released a statement describing a failed negotiation with an unreliable independent developer who had walked away at the last moment over inflated ego and unrealistic valuation demands. Grant's name appeared in 3 business publications within hours. Every article mentioned that he worked as a maintenance technician at a hotel. The framing was careful and deliberate. Sylvia Crowe said nothing publicly about the dinner itself. Brett Lawson contacted 2 of Mallory Structural Systems' engineering partners directly to suggest that Grant's decision had exposed the company's investors to significant financial risk. Tom Reardon watched the hotel's corporate events calendar begin to thin. 3 bookings canceled inside a week, each citing vague scheduling conflicts, each connected to firms that had received calls from people inside Crowe Capital's network. Grant sat with that damage quietly for longer than felt comfortable. Then he read the full implementation proposal Crowe Capital had submitted during due diligence. A document he had never been shown in its complete form. Arthur Kane had finally obtained it through a formal document request. Buried inside was an operational appendix that changed the shape of everything. Sylvia Crowe's actual plan for FrameCheck had nothing to do with building safety. The software was to be deployed selectively against properties owned by her competitors. A false positive structural alert, easily generated by adjusting the sensitivity thresholds above what the system's protocols permitted, would trigger mandatory city inspections, force expensive remediation timelines, suppress property valuations, and create acquisition opportunities for Crowe Capital at distressed prices. The protective parameters Grant had specifically negotiated into the agreement, the ones preventing threshold manipulation and requiring independent verification before any regulatory notification, had been quietly removed from the version the board had reviewed. Sylvia had approved the removal. Grant understood then that he had not simply been dealing with a person who was careless about how she spoke to people in service positions. He had been dealing with a person who intended to take a tool built to protect people from structural failure and use it to manufacture structural failure for profit. Eleanor Hatch, the Crowe Capital Board chairwoman, called Grant and told him that withdrawing from an agreement of this magnitude over a personal conflict reflected poorly on his judgment as a business person. Grant did not yet reveal the appendix. He asked, politely and specifically, for a board-level meeting. He brought Arthur Kane. He brought 3 of his engineers. He brought the original implementation document and the altered version side by side, the removed clauses highlighted in a format a non-engineer could read in under 2 minutes. He brought records of the hotel booking cancellations traced back to Crowe's communications firm. And he brought, because Zoe had found it by accident while searching for something unrelated on a shared cloud account, a forwarded internal message from Sylvia to Brett Lawson that said, in 8 words, his company is small enough to outlast in court. Eleanor Hatch read the documents in the order they were presented. She did not speak for a long moment after the final page. Then she asked the board's independent counsel to step out of the room with her. When the board voted, Sylvia Crowe was removed under the company's misconduct provisions. Brett Lawson was placed under a separate internal investigation. Monica Tran was given temporary authority to preserve all records connected to the FrameCheck negotiations. Sylvia walked out of the boardroom, still issuing instructions to an assistant, who was no longer required to carry them out. The same afternoon, Grant signed a licensing agreement with the National Building Safety Consortium, a network of mid-size commercial developers and municipal inspection agencies that had been waiting 18 months while the Crowe negotiations ran their course. The agreement was worth $98 million. It included every protective clause Grant had originally written. It included an independent audit right retained by Mallory Structural Systems. It included a 5-year prohibition on threshold manipulation without third-party review. And it included equity positions for the 4 engineers who had built FrameCheck alongside Grant during the years when it was only a theory and a second-hand laptop, and whatever hours were left after the hotel went quiet. Tom Reardon held a dinner at the Alderton Grand the weekend after the signing. Zoe sat at the same table as the engineers and their families, and worked through the breadbasket before the appetizers arrived, which Grant noted with the particular quiet satisfaction that belongs only to parents. Toward the end of the evening, she leaned across the table and asked him, in the direct way she had inherited from her mother, whether he was finally going to stop wearing the gray uniform. He told her he hadn't decided. She rolled her eyes. He told her that the reason he kept coming back had nothing to do with the uniform and everything to do with The fact that the building's northeast stairwell still had a sensor cluster reading 3 degrees off calibration, and it was going to bother him until he fixed it himself. Zoe said that was possibly the most him answer he had ever given her. He didn't argue, because she was right. Sylvia Crowe faced shareholder litigation in the months that followed. The slow institutional kind that doesn't make headlines the way a board vote does, but costs considerably more over time. She said in one interview that the frame check negotiation had fallen apart due to personality incompatibilities at the executive level. The journalist didn't press the point. Grant read it once, set his phone face down on the kitchen table, and went back to the structural model he was reviewing for a new client in Portland. The northeast stairwell sensor cluster read correctly within the week. Grant calibrated it himself on a Tuesday morning before the first hotel guests were awake. The building quiet around him in the particular way. Buildings are quiet when every system inside them is functioning exactly as designed. He had never believed the work was beneath him. He had never believed that fixing something broken made the person doing the fixing any smaller than the problem they solved. Sylvia Crowe had looked at a man in a gray uniform and seen a ceiling. What she had missed, what people like her always missed, was that he had never once been looking up.